Thanks very much. We're always delighted to co-host with the International House. So many of you were with us last week as we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And with us with that celebration, and also as a Pacific Leadership Fellow, is our speaker tonight, Arindam Bhattacharya. And to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the school and what we have dedicated ourselves to in terms of teaching and scholarship and service, I really can't think of a more appropriate person to have here with us during this time than Arindam. He is currently a senior partner and director of the Boston Consulting Group, one of the world's major management consulting companies, and he's played leadership roles throughout BCG. He is currently co-leader of the Bruce Henderson Institute. And so what we've seen in the last number of years is a very interesting development in the major consulting firms of taking on the role of giving folks time to think and pause and reflect about what they've learned on the job. And so Arindam is serving as something like the globalization guru for BCG as the company begins to think about how it charts its course and helps its clients in a period of quite dramatic global change. During his time at BCG, he's had leadership roles throughout the company, on the global leadership team in the public sector and social impact practices, on its industrial goods practice, and on its global advantage initiative. He came to BCG after having been educated at the Indian Institute of Technology, at the Indian Institute of Management, and then obtaining his PhD in engineering at the University of Warwick. It's just been a delight for us these 2 weeks to have the opportunity to engage him in conversation. He's a polymath. He's a natural person to have at a university, and we're delighted that he has joined the International Advisory Board of GPS, and that we'll have the pleasure of enjoying his company for years to come. Arindam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Hansen, for your kind words. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and share my thoughts and ideas on a topic which is close to my heart, but also very close to the heart of this wonderful school, globalization. Oops. How do I get the slideshow going? So just to give a bit of background, and I've been researching and talking about globalization for over a decade now. And very recently, relatively recently, in 2015, I was attending the annual event of World Economic Forum in Davos. Come. Annual event of World Economic Forum in Davos, and one of the internal kind of documents which was circulated among all the participants was provocatively titled, "Globalization is Dead." Now that surprised me. Coming from the other part of the world, which had, in some sense from India, which had opened up to globalization only a couple of decades ago, and were very much looking forward to what benefits it could bring to the country. Just coming across, and that was a time when all the rise of these anti-globalization nationalist movements were going on in Europe, as well as the rhetoric was kind of picking up in the US elections around that time. So it got me thinking that what's the reality? This is the narrative that's playing out in the Western media. Globalization is dead. And the article, the cover page of this Economist is striking. This is actually a couple of years before, showing the future of globalization as a sinking ship. And then you had all over the other kind of mainstream media, this whole narrative that the end of globalization is coming, that is globalization finished, and so on and so forth. And clearly there was a basis for this narrative that was emerging in the Western press and also in the political movements. One, if you look at the traditional metric of globalization, and there are two fundamentally. One is trade and another is foreign direct investment. And both of these, in fact, had been stagnating for some time. So if you look at this graph, it basically shows that trade intensity, which is nothing more than the total global trade divided by global GDP, which had grown kind of over the whole century, 20th century. I mean, below around, end of 19th century, it was less than 10%. And by the time we hit the economic crisis, it had reached nearly 60%. But after that, it had really peaked and stagnated. So really, it meant that the trade was growing at the same pace as global GDP instead of growing much faster. So there was some basis of this. The other one was really, if you look at foreign direct investment, again, this graph shows a foreign direct investment as a share of global GDP and also as a share of gross capital formation. And again, over the last kind of decade, it's been kind of stagnating. So really, in some sense, the big question that was being risen, particularly from a business perspective, I'm not talking more from the political perspective, business perspective is, are we seeing a kind of a degrowth of globalization, or as someone said, if it's not dead, is it dying? So that's one narrative, and it really got me thinking that is this the only narrative? Is globalization really kind of dying? And what I found was some really, really interesting examples, non-traditional examples, non-typical examples of companies, of startups and established companies, and that started me thinking, what's really happening? Now, you all know of Netflix. And most of you probably would have used Netflix to downstream different kind of programs. Now, Netflix today can be watched in more than 190 countries. In 2010, they were in only one country, the US. So they had revenues of around $2 billion, but in 7 years, they went from one country to 190 countries, with the revenues growing by more than 5 times. That gets you thinking, because perhaps the world had never seen this pace of globalization by a company over the last 100 years. Even more striking to me was an example, which is, again, a completely non-typical example, and I'm using the examples to illustrate the point of a fundamental shift that is happening. Again, I don't know how many of you have played this game, Pokemon Go. I know it's a kind of a trivial example, but it makes a really important point. How many of you have played Pokemon Go? David, I knew you would have played. It was, to me, interesting to see that a small company in the west coast of US, a company called Niantic, when they launched Pokemon Go in 2016, in 7 months, they went from one location to 127 countries and had revenues of $1 billion. Now, to me, again, this is something which is just at a pace of globalization which is not kind of slow. This is a kind of rocket booster. And I still remember, and contrast this with a couple of years ago, another, and this time very large gaming company launched their product, a revolutionary product called the Wii. I don't know how many of you played Wii a few years ago. And I remember it took more than 2 years for that product, and it's a physical console that you play with it on the TV, the games. It took more than 2 years for that game to come to India. And this time, when Pokemon Go was launched, my sons were playing that game within a month of its launch. So to me, this was a very different kind of architecture of global business models that was emerging, where the companies were being able to globalize at a pace which had never happened before in what I call the analog 20th century. This got me to again thinking, so what is emerging? And behind this, what Netflix and with Netflix and Niantic and many other companies who are building these business models, is this whole thing about data and about connectivity. In this graph, in this slide, we show two graphs at the pace at which global data flow is exploding. Between 1992, you had 100 gigabytes per day to, estimated by 2020, over 60,000 gigabytes per second. Now that is an exponential growth of what is happening. And behind this is not just social media. Behind this is large number of new business models that are emerging, that are creating new services and solutions for their customers. And that is because if you look at the graph on the right, it really shows the number of connected devices. These are both your smartphones as well as connected machines, all kinds of connected devices and sensors which are going to be there in the world. And just imagine when they start generating and transmitting data around the world, I mean, you have this kind of radical growth in global data. So now you have these two narratives. The one narrative is the traditional metrics that we saw, and also the kind of the media reports that are coming up and they're giving rise to a lot of these anti-global nationalistic governments. On the other hand, you have this kind of explosion of global data, which is fundamentally changing the way businesses and people communicate and the way businesses are run. So when you step back and look at these two narratives, the big question that then, the answer to my question is globalization dead. And the first to me was the globalization is not dead. But it is not the same. It is fundamentally changing. It is different. So the next question that came up in my research was, so this is fine. Yes, globalization is changing, but what is it changing to? So what does it mean for global businesses, given that as a BCG, our work is really with global businesses and also with some of the country governments, but primarily with businesses. And so the big question that they have so what should we be doing differently than what we have been doing in the last 30, 40 years? And that got me to starting to understand question, so how has globalization evolved over the last 150 years in modern times? So when I look at it, you realize that globalization has been shaped by two forces, and you'll recognize these forces. The first is technology. What has technology done? I mean, starting with steam engine and then containers and then internet, it has fundamentally reduced the cost of movement across countries and between countries. And that has led to development of the global supply chains, that has led to the company setting up kind of a global footprint, a global organization. At the same time, this has been facilitated by the growth of multilateralism, the new institutions that have, in some sense, shaped the rules of the game. So the countries know that technology is giving them the ability to create a global business model, and multilateralism is helping them shape the rules of the game that they play around with. And that has led to the global presence in different countries. You have globally integrated supply chains, and you have global organizations. But what this slide doesn't show are two very, very critical characters, which has also shaped globalization. The first character is what I call the economic structure, US. US has been, in some sense, the instigator and the guarantor of this model of globalization since they kind of hosted the Bretton Woods Agreement post-World War II and helped craft these multilateral institutions. But as the preeminent economic kind of power, they in some sense made sure that the rules were developed and rules were then kind of enforced. And the other interesting character in this whole story are the customers. Because whatever business activity you do, if you don't have a customer, then there is really no business. And what I found very interesting is when you define a global customer, you fundamentally define a global customer by his, what I call geographic coordinates. Which country, which state, which city, which location, zip code he was in. Because as a global company, if you have to serve a global customer, you had to physically go and serve the customer with a product or a service. Because that's the only way you could sell. As we saw, both Netflix and Niantic didn't have to do it. So really, when you step back, I saw that 4 forces are fundamentally transforming the model of globalization that has emerged over the last 150 years. The first is, we all know, technology. We had 3 waves of technology, and we have a 4th wave of digital technologies, which is fundamentally changing the economics of global supply chain. And I'll give an examples of how that is happening. The second is the framework of multilateralism that had developed and which has set a fairly stable and well understood rules of the game are being upended by the growing economic nationalism, growing bilateralism, growing regionalism. And if you look at the data behind it, between 2010 and 2016, countries actually notified 2.5 times more anti-trade measures than pro-trade. I mean, fundamentally, and it is not just one country, it is a whole set of countries who are taking more anti-trade measures than they were pro-trade, which was very different in the earlier phases of globalization. So these 2 forces, which had shaped over the last 150 years, are undergoing a transformation, but more critically to me is that the economic structure of the world, which was shaped by US's being the sole economic pole, is also getting fundamentally transformed with the emergence of China as a competing economic pole with a very different economic model and very different political model. And really, in some sense, the agreements, I mean, whatever agreements the 2 economic poles come to, they will shape the battlefield for the rest of the world and all the global companies. It's very different from the model that all global companies had got used to over the last 150 years. But one of the most interesting things, and I think this is not well recognized as much as the other 3 forces, which are fairly well recognized, is a fundamental shift that is happening. And how do you define a global customer? Earlier, as I said, the global customer is defined by the local geographic coordinates. But today, digital connectivity means that, for someone like Niantic, every customer in the world was a global customer. The only thing that stopped them from kind of reaching to all the countries the moment they launched a product, and as I said, they took a few months, was translating their into the local language and making sure that they meet the local regulatory needs. So really the concept of customer getting, in some sense, constrained by physical location is getting transformed, is getting fundamentally changed to saying that the customer today is a global customer wherever he may be. And I found it very interesting that the way Netflix looks at its customer is not by countries. They have divided the customers into nearly 1,300 what they call taste communities. What do they mean by that? Communities means that each community actually consumes content in a certain way. And they all get, based on the consumption patterns, they all get the same recommendation when a new program comes in or you switch it on. And today, because of a password, wherever you are, you can use your password to access Netflix. And they will know exactly who you are. They'll know exactly what kind of content you consume. And they'll give you the same kind of recommendation wherever you may be. And this is very, very different from the way you would sell a car to Indian in India or to an American in the US. And that, to me, is a fundamental shift that global companies are realizing that today it doesn't matter where the customer is. It is more important to start finding out who is the customer and what is it that they want. Because today you can have a dynamic two-way conversation with a customer wherever he may be and wherever you are positioned as a company. So when I kind of put all of it together and kind of stepped back and said, so what does it mean? How do I now define the world? Is this globalization? Is this beyond globalization? Is this new globalization? And that's why in my presentation, the cover page, I had a question mark. How would you define this word? Because there's some things which are dramatically different. It is not anti-globalization, but it is something new. And to me, it basically meant that you need to start rethinking the mental paradigms that we've all developed over the last few decades of how do we think of globalization. And I will draw some implications both for global companies, but also for industries and for public policy in countries. So let me try and summarize what is my takeaway from this. First is, for any global company, the first thing is that the patterns of global growth and trade are fundamentally changing. So you have, as we saw, a stagnant trade intensity, but at the same time, while physical trade is growing only perhaps at the rate of global GDP, but global digital trade and services trade is growing much, much faster. So that again then kind of gives them answer, because if you ask any CEO, what is your number one agenda, they'll always say, where do I get growth? So you now start to think that the growth is coming from something which is very dramatically different, particularly for industrial companies, than what they have been traditionally doing. The second interesting thing that I found was, if you look at, say, 2005, 2003, and you went and made a presentation as a global company to an analyst in the Wall Street, I mean, the only thing they will ask is, so what is the emerging market strategy? Because emerging market was the big thing at that time driving growth. Today, you look at emerging markets. There's some who are growing, some who are stagnating, some who are degrowing. I mean, a country which was seen as very attractive, like Brazil or Thailand, today you go and look at their growth rates. It is highly uncertain how they will evolve, for very different reasons. BRICS became a term that was kind of developed by analysts, and it became the kind of hot kind of term. But if you look at BRICS countries, I mean, the growth rates are completely different. So growth is becoming no more driven by a label, like emerging markets or BRICS, or whichever level you want. But growth is becoming much more country-specific. At the same time, it is becoming lot more volatile. And that is a huge question in the minds of global CEOs. How do I place the bets on investment? Where do I place the bets on investment? Should I go into, say, Brazil today, or should I wait it out? And that is one of the big questions that they're facing, that in terms of just the growth pattern. And the third, which is a much more secular kind of pattern that is clearly emerging, is the rise of Asia. And while the trade between the traditional trading kind of routes, say US and Europe, is stagnating or going down in many products, the intra-Asia trade is growing. And so you need to again start thinking that as a US company, as a European company, where the biggest growth is coming in Asia and the intra-Asia trade is growing, then what should be my strategy for growth? I mean, can I be an American company and play a much bigger role, or should I start rethinking how do I position as a global company with the growth of Asia? So that is number one shift that's happening in the mental model. The number two shift that is happening in the mental model is what I call the new customer and the changing behaviors. Earlier, the customer was constrained and restricted by his global presence. If you had to sell a car, you had to go and set up a dealership in those countries. You had to physically set up assets. You had to physically set up large teams in those countries. And the companies like Netflix and Pokemon Go and lots of others today don't have a big presence to be able to sell in these countries because you don't need physical presence and assets because of the emergence of global customer. And also, interestingly, what is also happening is because of connectivity, earlier you would do a sale of a product or service and then kind of forget the customer, because communicating with the customer, continuously was extremely expensive. But because you have now ubiquitous connectivity and the falling cost of bandwidth, I mean, the customers are saying and telling you if they are happy with your product, if they're happy with your service, and they're saying, we don't want an asset. We want a solution to our problem. We want a better experience. And that is a fundamental shift, because no longer companies have to sell a product. They have to sell a fundamental solution, which fundamentally means that you have to integrate a physical product with a kind of data connectivity and a solution, and price it very differently and deliver it very differently than the way you would deliver a physical product. The third mental shift that is happening is in terms of, you have to make is in terms of the global supply chains and the global business model. Because of what I call the new economics, which is moving away from the economics driven by the factor costs to economics which are increasingly driven by data. And the other interesting thing, because of technology, what companies, and I'll again illustrate this with some examples, is what companies have found that they can move away from just pure cost efficiency driven supply chains to building the supply chains for speed, for flexibility, and also resilience, because as we saw earlier, the global growth rates and risks are increasing, so you need to build global supply chains which are much more resilient to any kind of changes. If sudden tariff comes, then you should be able to address those kind of sudden costs. And the last mental model is what I call the cultural narrative on globalization. And this was brought to me kind of live when I had the opportunity, as part of my research over the last few years, I had the opportunity to talk to about 50, 60 global CEOs and CXOs. And one of the earliest interviews with the vice chairman with one of the largest global engineering company, he said, it's very unfortunate that politicians and political leaders have forgotten that globalization was a win-win. It helped hundreds of millions of people around the world come out of poverty. And the same conversation with him, 3 years later, he said completely different. He said, there is nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong if a country wants to maximize its own benefits first, as it wants to get growth and jobs. And if they ask us to help support the development of their country, then we have to kind of accept it and agree with it and kind of contribute to the development of the country. Now, that's a very, very different model, and where it clearly showed to me that the narrative that he had in his own mind, the cultural narrative that he had in his own mind about globalization has fundamentally changed. So it has becoming from a win-win political business narrative to a narrative that is increasingly defined by society. And I find that in this narrative we have, in fact, not one but two narratives, and they are kind of contrasting narratives. On one hand, you have the narrative of economic nationalism, you have tribalism, you have ethnocentricity, where the countries are erecting borders to immigration, to people flow. At the same time, you have individuals. As each individuals, we are more and more globally connected. We are becoming actually more global. We are traveling more around the world. We are working more in global teams seamlessly. So this kind of contrasting narratives is shaping a unique narrative of globalization. So when you step back and put all this together, to me it appears that we need to really rethink our mental models that we had developed over the last 100 years on what globalization is, and recalibrate, recast the mental models and accept that the world in the 21st century is going to be fundamentally different along these 4 dimensions. So let me just kind of show you a glimpse of each one of them and then kind of bring it all together into certain implications for companies, for industries, and what I believe are some important policy questions that this gives rise to. This slide was a kind of striking slide, and this is some analysis that we have done within BCG's Henderson Institute. It just shows the dramatic shift of where each country's economic share of global GDP and where the growth is coming from. So on the extreme left, you have the share of GDP, global GDP, and as you can see, it's 48% of EU and North America, which is Canada and the US. By 2030, this will come down to maybe 26, 27, 28%. And India and China alone, and 2030 is just a decade away. It is not many decades away. India, China alone, conservatively, will contribute to a bigger share, 33%, 32%, 34%. And what is even more interesting, and that is what gets all the global companies to really start thinking what and how we should be thinking and constructing a business model. 50% of the growth in the next decade is going to come from India and China. And this poses a very kind of unique set of questions, which was brought to me when I had a chance to talk to a CEO in one of the largest engineering companies in Finland. And he said, my largest market is China. So we can't do without China if you want to survive as a global company. But we don't know what to do with it, given all the challenges that are there to compete there. So that's the kind of conundrum that more and more companies are facing, because lots of them who have been in China for a long time have not made money. But there's some others who have made. So clearly there is a success formula there which still has to be decoded and used by many companies. This is a dramatic shift from where we started creating the multilateral framework after the World War II. Now, I talked about the global customer, and I found this example particularly revealing, and you know, as I said, completely out of the box. I don't know how many of you play games on this platform called Fortnite. Anyone here who does it? So this is the most popular game. It is played by 200 million people out of in 85 countries. A couple of months ago, an electronic DJ, and his kind of stage name is Marshmello. He used this game platform to have a global electronic music concert, a 3D concert where you had these kind of avatars and others jumping out of the screen. He disabled all the kind of the features of a game, and all those who use this platform could log in and watch this musical extravaganza around the world at the same time. And it was visual. It was not something that, I mean, we all know that we hear radios, but it was a visual kind of 3D extravaganza. He tested the technology and he ran it for 10 minutes. And just imagine, in the 10 minutes, and it was watched by 11 million people. If he had charged $10, in those 10 minutes, he would have made $100 million. To me, this is the power that is emerging of what I call the global customer, who you can access using technology. It's no more about a country. It's no more about the physical location. You are actually creating a completely global market. I've talked about a global supply chain. Now, this is the factory of a large labor-intensive factory in China. Asia today produces 85% of the world's shoes. This has changed. I mean, perhaps at the beginning of 20th century, it would be, I don't know, whatever, small percentage, but by the end of 20th century, it was 85%. How many of you have heard of a new factory concept called Speed Factory? This is a Nike plant. Now, Speed Factory, there are two Speed Factories that have been set up by Adidas. These are completely automated, flexible, small 3D printers. Shoes which are 3D printed. There are two factories till now, one in Atlanta and one in Germany. And the board member of Adidas, who is responsible for global supply chain, said that over the coming decades, we'll have 50% of our global production of shoes coming from the Speed Factories. Now, what are these Speed Factories? The Speed Factory is, now if you look at the traditional supply chain of shoes, a company like Adidas or Nike, which produces most of the shoes in China or other Asian countries, they would have had to predict what kind of designs they need to get produced in these factories a year in advance, and then place the orders, because it just takes, the lead times of these supply chains is that long. It just takes that long to produce the shoes in large volumes and ship them around the world to the retailers in different countries. These factories produce shoes in small volumes, the latest design, and get them to the customers around in the location. These are not in low-cost countries, these are in high-cost countries. And more of these plants are being set up by everyone, because automation is, and along with the increased cost from trade, is fundamentally allowing you to change the way global supply chains were configured over the last few decades. My last point was, I thought about the cultural dimension of what is globalization. And the photograph on the left is from a multilateral, a kind of a World Trade Organization General Council meeting. They got together and they took decisions about the rules of trade or whatever change. And if you look at the right, it kind of illustrates the dichotomy of the two different cultural narratives. One is about the America first, the Italy first, the India's make in India, and so on, which are all about trying to put your country first in terms of thinking about, how do you participate in a global trading system. At the same time, this is a photograph from, World Economic Forum's annual event, where individually we are so more and more globally connected. And that, to me, is one of the most interesting cultural transformation that has happened over the last, say, the quarter of the 20th century to what is happening in the 21st century, where we are seeing these two very, very different kind of societal narratives actually shaping political narratives, because these fundamentally shape our political narratives and our policies. So when I look at, these examples are just kind of a glimpse of what I call this new 21st century model of globalization that is emerging. So what does it mean for global companies? So I kind of summarize them into 5 factors that all global companies are in some sense struggling with. I think that one slide seems to be missing. Anyway, I'll come to that. But let me just give you one example of what does it kind of question that global companies are raising. A couple of months ago, in a conversation with CEO of one of the largest American companies, making engineered goods, consumer goods, which has been global for over 100 years, he asked me a question. Why should we be global? What is the advantage that we have of being a global company? And it's a profound example, because 20 years ago, no CEO of a company that has been global for 100 years will ask this question, why should we be global? And he was asking the question very rightly because the economics of global presence, the economic advantage of being global from your supply chains, from access to customers is fundamentally changing. And so for some companies or some products, it still makes enormous sense to be global. For others, it doesn't. And for many others, as Jeff emailed in his presentation at the 30th anniversary keynote speech, said, you're moving away from the concept of global to a connected multi-country or multi-local. So you build a strong presence in the countries where you can win, and you connect them, rather than thinking that I want to be present in all the 190 countries, which had been the traditional model when how global companies actually had thought about globalization. So it's a very different kind of a question. And this shift has huge implications. I spoke about in terms of some of the global business models, but it has also huge implications of how industries will evolve. And also, public policy, fundamentally in terms of growth, jobs, and what I call our digital hegemony, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, this is a complex slide, so I'll take a couple of minutes with this slide. This shows what I call the profit pools in the automotive industry over the next 15 to 20 years. The line on the left is the share of profit pools of different profit pools, like selling components, parts, selling a new car, selling financial products, and selling insurance and service. This has been traditionally the way how global automotive companies have made profits over the last 100 years. The line below shows in 2035 where the profits in the industry are going to come from. So today, the traditional profit pools constitute nearly 99% of the total industry profits. This will become 60% by 2035. And 3 new sources of profits are going to come. So one is around electrification, products and software and electric vehicles. Another is around mobility services. That is growing the fastest. And the third one is actually around digital connectivity and data, the kind of solutions and services that you sell to your drivers. The car is no more a mechanical product. It is a sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated computer. And you sell all kinds of services to drivers, to the computer and to the drivers of the computer. And guess who's winning in this new profit pools? Not the traditional companies. Completely new companies, we all know that Google is trying to get into autonomous vehicles, electric cars. Mobility services are very different players. Automotive companies also trying to get into these, but new players are winning. And this, to me, is one of the big kind of public policy, raises a public policy question. And this is just a visual depiction of what I call the digital hegemony. Now, if you assume that in all industries going forward, the global profits are going to come from data and digital connectivity, guess who's winning in these profit pools? This is the picture of the search engine, which is really that the Chinese companies and the US companies dominate the world. Now, if they dominate these new profit pools, it has a huge implication for public policy, because what it really means is that you are not creating enough local value addition in assets and jobs, despite the fact that data is coming from these countries, or the customers who are the drivers are in these countries. So this is a shift. This is an example of automotive. This is happening in healthcare. This is happening in financial services. This is happening across more and more industries. So the industry structures are changing. New profit pools are emerging, and the winners in these new companies, and the way they play the globalization game is very, very different. My last slide, and then I'll open up a discussion, is really that and when I have a discussion, I had an opportunity to have multiple conversations with bureaucrats and political leaders in India. So what does it mean for India? What does it mean for India because of this new world? Now, if you look at historically, and I'm sure that there are many kind of more experts on this than I am, but if I look at historically how emerging markets have grown, and most emerging markets over the last 50 years have grown on the basis of two things. They have grown on the basis of manufacturing jobs, and they have grown on the basis of exports with the growing trade, which is a kind of goods trade. In a global economic environment that was stable, where the rules were fairly well defined, so the country knew where its competitive position is. Now today, both these things are fundamentally undergoing a change. So the rules are becoming more uncertain. You just don't know how US and China will finally negotiate it, how that will play out over the years. If you look at it, I mean, since President Trump took office, US has taken decisions that impacts 80% of world trade in some form or shape. At the same time, China is creating and crafting a completely different kind of trade regime through its One Belt, One Road initiative. And to me, that is very, very interesting kind of dynamics to see how this will all play out, because we are not sure. And that's one of the big, again, uncertainties that every kind of, business leader is facing. So from a country's perspective, also we have the question, so what does it mean for the competitiveness of countries? Would we be a big player? And the question that I had for India was really, how do you plan your next kind of model of growth over the next decade or two? At the same time, you have falling manufacturing employment. I mean, globally, the number of people employed in manufacturing industry is going down. I mean, if you look at the speed factory and you look at the other labor-intensive factory in China, I mean, the number of people that are employed in speed factory are 1/10 of the number of people would be employed in a similar size factory in China. You have this whole issue of digital hegemony, where Europe and India and a lot of other countries are not able to get the full benefit of all the data that is being generated in their country, or digital services and solutions that the customers in their country buy. And this, to me, is the two biggest kind of public policy questions that is facing political leaders in various parts of the world. So this is a kind of a very, very rapid tour of what I call the new, or beyond globalization, the new digital model of globalization that we are beginning to see. This will play out. This will play out over the next decades. It's not that it's completely transformed. This will play out over the next decades, but it really calls for us to rethink. And from BCG's perspective, I mean, it really calls for our clients to rethink how they will play the game over the next few years. So that's all I had really for you. I hope it provokes certain questions, and also as the school thinks about the kind of next areas of research, it provokes certain questions for them. But I'm very happy to kind of now engage with you and get your thoughts and views on what I call the new globalization. Thank you.